Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and today I'm getting around to that video that I promised to do that would review one of the videos that's actually on another YouTube channel, Backwaters of Reformdom, and consequently I've decided to call this video Breaking the Majority Text, or Upsetting Backwaters of Reformdom. Let's go ahead and just get right into the material here. Alright, so Backwaters of Reformdom, that is Brother Truelove from Christ Reformed Church, put out a couple of years ago an argument for why the majority text argument for the New Testament text is so strong. And so I'll go through and I'll run through his argument real quick here. And it's kind of presented as a worst case scenario. So let's say that we start with the original manuscript or manuscripts. The New Testament actually had multiple original manuscripts, but we'll just say the original in some way, shape, or form will represent it as just a green dot here. And then, of course, copies are made. And the particular model that Brother Truelove presented had 3 copies per starting copy, and 2 out of those 3 would be a correct copy. And we're talking about individual points of variation. At this particular point that we're looking at, it might be something that has to do with, the long ending of Mark. It might be something to do with 1 John 3:1. A particular point of variation, we're going to make 3 copies of that, and we're going to assume that at least 2 out of 3 copyists are able to get it right. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the first generation, we'll assume that 2 out of 3 copyists is correct. So you get 2 good copies, 1 bad copy, whatever the particular point of variation happens to be. And this model, frankly, is a fairly simple model in that it holds a lot of things as being fixed. It doesn't allow them to vary. It assumes that every manuscript in the previous generation is going to have 3 copies in the next generation. And of course, that doesn't always work out that way. That's actually hardly ever true, that you'll get an exact number of copies each time. And then also holds the proportion of correct copies to incorrect copies constant. But let's just go ahead with this and keep going here. So 2 out of 3 copyists get it right. You continue that into the next generation, each with these new copies getting 3 copies, and of course it gets a little bit more varied. In the second generation, you of course get 9 manuscripts total if you're assuming that each one produces 3. For the ones in green, 2 out of 3 will be good. For the ones in red, 2 out of the 3 will be bad, because it's 2 out of 3 correctly copy the manuscript ahead of them. And you can see here that the number of incorrect copies is increasing proportionally. First it was a 2-to-1 ratio, then it's a 5-to-4, still following the individual rule. And then by the time we get into the third generation, it's 14-to-13, which is a little bit less than 49% bad. And as you follow the model along, it tends towards a 50-50 split. In fact, you can actually reverse the numbers of good to bad. You can say that it's 1 bad to 2 good, and it will still tend towards a 50-50 split. And so what Brother Truelove's argument, and a lot of majority texters' argument would be, is that if a 50-50 split is basically the worst case scenario, that is, you would generally assume that most copyists would be able to correctly copy their exemplars more than 2/3 of the time. And so if this is a worst case scenario, where things tend towards a 50-50 split, and by the way, that would be a 50-50 split even if it was 9 good copies to 1 bad copy. It'll still tend towards a 50-50 kind of split. But basically the argument is if 50-50 is the worst case, and you have something that's a far better than a 50-50 split, like 80-20 or above, then that would be really strong evidence that that majority reading would be strong, would be correct. If the worst case is 50-50 and you've got something that's better than 50-50, then obviously that's a good argument for accepting that particular variance. At least that's how the logic goes. And regarding this worst case argument for the majority text, that is, if you do the cycles, comes down to 50-50, if you have something that's far better than a 50-50, that means it's correct. Regarding this model, Brother Truelove said the following. He said, "How do you falsify this? This is a science. Science should be capable of being falsified. How do you do that? You falsify the statistical model that I have presented by demonstrating a transmissional history that breaks the model. The only way that I know of, and those who hold this position know of, that the model could be broken is, again, a systematic recension of the text. That a critical addition was made at some point in history and imposed everywhere across the Greek-speaking Christian world. And that just didn't happen. It didn't happen." Pastor Robert Truelove, Christ Reformed Church. Okay, so he presents this model, says the model at worst tends towards a 50-50 split. And so if you've got something that's better than that, then evidently you're doing really good. That's good evidence that the majority reading is, especially if it's greater than an 80-20 split, then that's good evidence that it is, in fact, the original reading. And the only way that you could have a case where the majority wouldn't be right is if you had a systematic recension of the text. That is Brother Truelove's argument here. Now, is that good reasoning, though? Because, frankly, a lot of textual scholars who look at this, and certainly a lot of the ones that produce a lot of the mainstream textual resources that are out there, like the UBS 5, Nestle Aland, 28, Comfort's commentary on the New Testament, those kinds of things. All of the common mainstream resources that are out there do not use a majority text methodology. So if it's so obvious that the majority text is the best way to go, and if it's so obvious that the only way you could get around that would be with a recension, then why do all these people still reject the majority text? Well, the simple reason is that the majority text argument is one that can be easily broken, and you don't have to have a recension to break it. That is, while Brother Truelove argues that the only way to do it is with a recension of gathering the manuscripts, making an official version from them, and then telling everybody, okay, this is what you're going to now use and get rid of everything else. That's what an official recension for all of Christendom would be. Instead of doing that, there's actually a lot of ways that you could still get the majority text, the majority of readings, to be wrong. Here's a few of those. So the first one would be disproportionate copying. That is, if bad copies are the ones that are copied more often than not, then your majority is going to be wrong more often than not. Another problem would be removals of copies from the stream of transmission. That is, if a lot of your good copies, for whatever reason, get removed, not necessarily by an official recension, just by the vagaries of history, then you're going to have some problems. And then finally, and this is one of the more important ones in my opinion, is preferential treatment of variants during transmission. That is, when people are aware of multiple variants, they tend to pick the one they like. That is what most people prefer to do. It actually takes a lot of training to get yourself to go against what you want to do, what you would expect when it comes to copying anything. Not just biblical manuscripts, but anything in general. In order to overcome that bias, people are going to do what they want to do, generally speaking. And that applies to copying biblical manuscripts, it applies to copying other ancient manuscripts, it applies to just about everything that mankind wants to do. Mankind follows his desires very willy-nilly a lot of times. Alright, so let's talk about the first one, breaking the model by disproportionate copying. So just as Brother Truelove started out, we're going to start out with the original, and we're going to assume that it is correct, in so much as what was original is what we're trying to follow today. We're trying to follow what was originally written for us in Scripture, rather than what came down, 100, 200,000 years later. Okay, we're not following the traditions of men. We want to know what was originally given, so the original is the standard. Now here I'm going to use a little bit more likely scenario where I'm going to say that 9 out of 10 copies are going to be good copies at a particular point of variation. But even in the majority text model that Brother Truelove put forward, even if you do use a 9-to-1 ratio, 9 out of 10, you're still going to get a 50-50 kind of split in the end. That's just the way that the model goes. 50-50 is basically the worst case scenario, as long as you're holding everything constant. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show what happens when you don't hold it constant. And the first thing has to do with how many copies are made from each original. So let's do the first generation. We'll have that 9-to-1 split. So we had one original manuscript, and then we have 10 copies. 9 of those are correct at a particular point of variation. The other one is not. Okay, and now we're going to do some disproportionate copying. So our ratio before was 1 original to 10 copies. Let's break that. On the left-hand side, we have 9 original manuscripts for that generation. In the first generation, there were 9 good manuscripts. And let's say that from them, there are a total of 10 manuscripts made. We're still maintaining the 9-to-1 ratio, but as far as the number of copies that are made, it's only about 1 copy per copy in the previous generation. So not many copies are being made on the left, but still, they are, by and large, following whatever the previous generation of copies was. On the right-hand side, though, it's very different. It still follows the same ratio, where most of them are going to follow the previous generation. It's still a 9-to-1 ratio. But let's say that this copy gets made into many other copies down the road. So basically what you had is, okay, people came along with the original, they read it, they liked it, and the vast majority of the people who got it took it and they just kind of continued transmitting it down their own down in their own community. It stayed basically roughly proportional to the communities that they went to. On the right-hand side, though, you have someone who gets it, and unfortunately he doesn't get a good copy. Either he mistakenly copies it himself, or he's just the one who received it after the copies were made. And he decides, this is really important. We're going to go out and we're going to tell everyone. You know, it's like, you know, Baptist missionary or something. You know, we're going to make 30 copies of this thing. Well, his manuscript was bad, so most of his copies are probably going to be bad. In fact, it's very possible that all of his copies could be bad, but we'll say that, you know, at least 9 out of 10 of them are bad. So he makes a ton of copies. He makes 30 total because he wants to share this thing with everyone out there. Well, now we've got a problem. Now we have, in the second generation, we have more bad copies than we have good copies. That's an 11-to-19 ratio. But let's say that that mentality that this person has of going out and spreading it continues with some of the people that he influences. So in the third generation, these people over here on the left that were more conservative, let's say that they stay conservative, still have a 9-to-1 ratio going on here. But on the right, these people, and especially the people who got the majority of manuscripts, they really want to go out and they want to share this thing by and far and wide as much as they can. And so they make tons of copies. Well, because the manuscript that they started with was bad, and most of the manuscripts that were made from that was bad, most of the manuscripts you're going to wind up here are also going to be bad manuscripts. So now in this third generation of copies, we've got just 46 good copies at this particular point of variation to 254 bad copies now. That's over 84% bad. You listen to people who talk about the majority text and saying, well, you know, if it's better than an 80-20 split, that's real good evidence that reading with 80% reading or above is correct. Well, here, just in 3 generations, we've demonstrated that it's possible to get over 84% of the readings to be bad readings at a particular point of variation just through disproportionate copying. But of course, that's the problem. The majority text model that Brother Truelove put forward assumes that everything holds equally. Every copy gets copied the same number of times. The proportion of correct copying of the original to incorrect copying of the original is the same every single time. That's what that majority text model that winds up with a 50-50 worst case scenario split assumes. As soon as you start messing with that, though, you can get places where the majority text is incorrect. And of course, this is all in models. This is all hypothetical. This is what can happen. The question is, did that actually happen? So here's the model that would say that it's possible. Do we have evidence that it happened, though? Because that's the real question. Okay, you can make models all day long, but if you don't have historical evidence to back it up, it doesn't really matter. So the question that we would ask ourselves, now that we know what disproportionate copying is all about, where the bad copies get copied more often than the good copies, do we have evidence that this kind of thing was happening in history, where copies were being made disproportionately? Instead of every copy getting copied a certain number of times, some copies were getting copied more often than others. Do we have evidence of that? Yes, we actually do. And here's how you would know historically. You would go through the history, and if everything is being done proportionately, you would assume that a particular text type, like the Alexandrian or the Western or the Byzantine, that if they started out at a certain proportion and things were being copied proportionately, you would assume that the proportions at the beginning would be roughly the same as at the end. But that isn't true. And one of the best examples of that is the Byzantine text type. You can do it with other ones as well, because you'll see the same pattern by and large. You'll see differences in the proportions through the time. But one of the best ones to demonstrate this is the Byzantine text type. Okay, here is an image of the proportion of Byzantine to non-Byzantine manuscripts that we have through history. The light gray part is the non-Byzantine manuscripts. The dark gray is the Byzantine manuscripts. And then along the vertical axis, we have each century. So starting with the 2nd century, because that's where we first get manuscripts, 3rd, 4th, 5th, so on, all the centuries going up. And then on each line, we have the number of non-Byzantine manuscripts to the number of Byzantine manuscripts, and then a percentage running along the bottom, so you can have an idea of where it comes out at. You'll notice that in the first couple of centuries, there are no Byzantine manuscripts that we have. Now, we also don't have a ton of manuscripts for them, only about 50 or so between the 2 centuries. And so it's possible, that they occurred earlier, but we just simply don't have evidence of it. It's a possibility. 4th century, we have one manuscript that shows up that's Byzantine, and people actually dispute that. Some people would start that the first time we get a distinctly Byzantine manuscript is in the 5th century, but I'll be generous and say it starts at least in the 4th. But after that, it starts growing. And you can keep track of the percentage here of how many non-Byzantine manuscripts there are. It starts out, 100% for the first couple manuscripts, and then it gets a little bit smaller. And then as time goes on, the non-Byzantine manuscripts get smaller and smaller, while the Byzantine manuscript percentage is getting bigger and bigger as you follow through the centuries of what we have. And if you extended this graph upward, up through, say, the 16th century, you'd see this line here just explode over. So what we have is something that starts out basically either non-existent or in the majority, and then by the time we get into the 16th century, which is off the scale of this graph, it becomes the majority reading. That's not proportionate copying. So the majority text model that says that 50-50 is the worst case doesn't hold in the history of the New Testament text, and we know it doesn't hold because we know that things were copied disproportionately. We have a text type that starts in the minority, and it doesn't stay in the minority. It becomes the majority with time. So that is disproportionate copying, which means that the majority text argument doesn't hold there. Okay, the majority text argument assumes that all of the manuscripts that are getting made are, at least roughly speaking, getting copied the same number of times down through history, but that clearly isn't the case. Here we have evidence that the proportion is shifting significantly by the time that where you get to 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, where it's pretty much all Byzantine manuscripts, or at least Byzantine in general character. Okay, so the proportion shifted. It started majority, ends up in the majority. That's disproportionate copying. That breaks the majority text model. Okay. It proves that it's possible that the majority could be wrong, and there is historical reason to believe that that is actually the case. All right, but it doesn't stop with just disproportionate copying. There's other problems that can happen as well. A very similar problem is the removal of copies. So again, we'll start with original, and that's what we're trying to go to. So it's the one in green. It's the one that we want. Okay, so we start with the original. We want to know what was originally said, and we make our copies from there. I'm going to do the same thing as I did before, a 9-to-1 ratio for good to bad. And I'm also going to hold the number of copies made from each previous copy the same. I didn't do that before. Before, I allowed certain copies to be copied more frequently than others just to see what can happen with disproportionate copying. This time I'm going to say the number of copies that is made from each previous one is the same, and the ratio of good to bad is 9-to-1 Okay, so let's go into the second generation with this. And the second generation, lo and behold, has mostly good copies. Now, you do see it decreasing, though. First generation was a 9-to-1 split. Second generation is 82 to 18, so the percentage is getting smaller. Like I said, it's tending towards that 50-50 split that the majority text model predicts being the case. But here is where I'm going to change things up a little bit. Let's say you have some Roman soldiers that come through, and they start burning manuscripts. And this was the policy in the Roman Empire for a time, and especially a very rather nasty period in church history towards the end of the Roman persecution of Christianity, where, among other things, they would actively seek out Christian manuscripts and burn them. And it happened across the Roman Empire. And so let's go ahead and take out the left side of this diagram here. Okay, that would definitely be the majority of manuscripts, 81 and 9. That's 90 out of the 100 manuscripts that are in this generation. Okay, the Romans went through and they took out most of what was there. They managed to find it and burn it. It's gone. And so the third generation now is going to be based on a minority of manuscripts that now, because they're the only ones surviving, they're now the majority. And unfortunately, the proportion of bad to good in this generation on this particular side of things wasn't so great. It started with a bad copy here, and so there's that 9-to-1 ratio, meaning most of them are going to be bad. If you start with a bad copy, most of your resultant copies are going to be bad. And so that's going to carry through on into the third generation, so most of those ones are now bad. We've actually reversed the second generation here. Second generation was 82 good to 18 bad. Now, because this stream right here got cut off, the Romans burning those manuscripts, hypothetically speaking, now it's 18 to 82 in favor of the bad manuscripts. So again, here's a case where we can get over 80% bad in just a few generations if you allow the model to vary. The majority text model works really good as long as nothing changes. But if you change something and say, what would happen if, well, then all kinds of strange things happen. But of course, like I said before, this is just a model. It doesn't mean anything unless there's actually historical evidence to back it up. So let's look at that. So second bit of historical evidence. Do we actually have evidence that Greek manuscripts, because that's what we're talking about here, Greek manuscripts were removed from circulation? If that happened, we would expect to see places where we know historically they were making Greek manuscripts, and then historically we know that by and large they stopped. They might make some here and there, but by and large we know that they stopped making Greek manuscripts. And it turns out that's exactly what we see regarding the Western transition to Latin and the Islamic expansion. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a kind of a cutesy little graph of the Roman Empire, which was basically early Christendom, the early Christian world. Now over here you have Asia Minor, ancient Greece, Italy, where Rome is, Gaul. Actually, which one was Gaul? Was it France or Spain? I think Gaul was Spain. Anyways, I'm sorry here. Modern day France, modern day Spain, Northern Africa, Egypt, Palestine. That's what it was known in the Roman world was as Palestine, not as Israel. Okay, so that is the early Christian world here, and a lot of people throughout this region were Christianized. And early on, all of these regions had Greek New Testament manuscripts. But there was a problem in the West. In the West, the common language that everyone spoke wasn't Greek. That was the language that the manuscripts came in was Greek. But the common language that everyone spoke there wasn't Greek, it was Latin. And so, fairly early on, they started taking these Greek manuscripts and translating them into Latin. So much so that by the time we get to the 4th century with Jerome, he sees fit to make an official version in Latin. And of course, that official version didn't take on popularity for a few hundred more years. But that is the general trend that we see, that Latin has become so predominant for the church in this area that they basically stop using Greek and they transition almost entirely just to Latin resources. There's still a few Latin manuscripts that get made, say, in the 5th century, usually as diglots. They have Latin on one side, Greek on the other. But by and large, the church in the West abandons Greek and starts using Latin. So the entire Western Christian region, they stop producing Greek. That's the important thing. Those Greek manuscripts that are there, they cease to be in production, Latin takes over. So the Greek production stops there effectively. Like I said, there's a few pockets here and there where they're still producing Greek manuscripts. By and large, it dies. And of course, and that's going from the 5th into the 6th centuries, where you stop seeing any great amounts of Greek manuscripts being made in the West. And then picking up in the 7th century, 7th and 8th centuries, you have another religion come on the scene, a religion that is antagonistic to Christianity, and that is Islam. And Islam, from the 7th into the 8th centuries, spreads very rapidly. Comes in from Saudi Arabia, and it winds up taking over Northern Africa. Northern Africa takes over Egypt, it takes over Palestine, it takes over Asia Minor, and frankly, Islam is not good for the production of New Testament manuscripts, Greek, Latin, or otherwise. These places, by and large, do not produce much in the way of manuscripts anymore. I'm not saying that it altogether ceases there, but when you have a regime over you in charge of your lands that is fundamentally antagonistic to you, it's not going to be pretty. Okay, so the only area that is left producing Greek New Testament manuscripts in the ancient Christian world is basically ancient Greece. And what we see today corresponds with what we see in the history. That is, most Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have, as far as localities are concerned, most of them come from Greece, which makes sense because they were the only place that was left producing Greek New Testament manuscripts. So what happened? The vast majority of places that were producing Greek New Testament manuscripts, for one reason or another, stopped. So that means that the vast majority of Greek New Testaments are no longer represented in the final generations that came down. The final generations that came down were representative of what was going on basically in ancient Greece, what used to be ancient Greece, and then which basically then became the center of Eastern Orthodoxy, going from the 8th century forward, essentially. Okay. So is there historical evidence that there was a cessation of production in a wide swath of lands that used to use Greek New Testament manuscripts? Yes, there is. There's a very good historical evidence that happened, which means, again, that model that we talked about just a slide before, where you have some of them getting cut off and then you possibly can get the majority being wrong, it means that model is a viable model rather than the majority text model. And then finally, the one that I consider to be the most important is the preferential treatment issue. And this one I'm not going to do the little tree diagram like I did before, because when it comes to preferential treatment, it's really hard to visualize what's going on. And so I chose a concentric circle pattern. That is, we still start with the original, and that's what we want to get to. It's the one ingredient. It's the one that's right. But when it comes to preferential treatment, the issue is people preferring a variant. It's not, that is, they're aware of multiple variants, and there's one out of those that they like. So they're not copying it proportionally. Instead, they're copying it based on what they prefer. So let's have an example here. In the first generation, let's say 2 of the copies that are made at this particular point of variation are exactly like the original. But one of the copies that's made, I'm going down to 3 copies being made here just because with this model it gets huge if I try to do the normal 9:1. It just gets bigger than I can really show on the screen here. But let's say that one of those manuscripts that is made is intentionally changed. Let's take a fairly classic example of, like, say, Luke 23:34, where there's a variant reading there. Some manuscripts have Jesus saying from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," and other manuscripts don't have that. And the question is, is it original or not, and all those kinds of things. And I'm going to probably explain that in another video on down the line, where that comes in and all that. But here's the main issue. Let's say that for whatever reason that's put in there, okay, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, but that reading, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," is definitely going to be a preferred reading. That is, it matches people's expectations, and they want to have that in their manuscripts. Okay, it matches what people think they know about what Jesus has said, what he did, his general character. So this is now a preferred reading. People want to have it. And preferential treatment has to do with comparison. So let's always compare two manuscripts at a time and see what happens. If we compare just the top two manuscripts, where there's only one reading that's available, so all of the manuscripts that get made from these top two, and we're going to say there's 3 made from every comparison. So for these two, the 3 that will be up here will all be green because there's no other options. Let's take the bottom 2 on the left. There's one manuscript that has the original reading, and then there's one manuscript that has a preferred reading. Whether it be Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or whatever the case happens to be, the scribe who is now going to make his copies, his 3 copies based on those 2 originals, those 2 exemplars more specifically, he has a choice to make. Do I follow the shorter reading over here that doesn't have Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or is he going to follow this one that does have Jesus saying that? Well, there's 2 ways that he could think of it. He could say, well, there's a possibility that this longer reading over here is correct, and so I don't want to lose it, so I'm going to put it in my manuscripts. The other way he could look at it is saying, okay, which one matches what I think I know about Jesus? Well, to me, it makes sense that Jesus would say, Father, forgive them, so I'm going to go with that one. Either way you look at it, he's going to prefer that reading. So these 3 manuscripts that are made from these 2 exemplars are all going to have that preferred reading, because it's a preferred reading. They want to have it in there. And the same thing with the 2 on the right. One doesn't have that preferred reading, the other one does. We're comparing the 2. We're going to make our copies follow the preferred reading. So second generation, the majority of the manuscripts now have the preferred reading in them. We compared and contrasted, we picked the variants that we like, and so the variants that we like are the ones that get perpetuated the most. And you continue this on out to the 3rd generation, the problem just becomes that much bigger. Now we've got only 6 good manuscripts to 21 manuscripts that have the preferred reading in it, right, wrong, or indifferent. And I don't have space on the screen to show this, but if you went out to the 4th generation, you'd get 15 good manuscripts to 66 that have preferred readings. So over 81% has preferred readings in it simply because it's preferred. Not because it's necessarily original, but because it is preferred. This is what people want to have. And so whenever they compare a couple of manuscripts, like these 2 in the upper left here, one good, one bad, or one good, one with a preferred reading in it, they're going to make all of their copies follow that preferred reading. That's what a preferred reading is. Okay, so is it possible that we could get more than 80% to be incorrect manuscripts by preferential treatment? Oh, certainly. In a few generations, this is just 4th generation of copying here. And it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much at all. So, again, this is just a model. This says that it's possible to have multiple bad copies if people are treating it preferentially. The question is, in the history, do we have people treating variants preferentially? That's the real question. Models are fine and all, but are they supported by historical evidence? Well, it is. If certain variants were indeed treated preferentially, then we should be able to find variants that were once described as common, but less preferable, which later became, due to their non-preferable nature, markedly uncommon. An example of this would be the variant locality name Gerasenes. Matthew 8:28, Mark 5:1, Luke 8:26. Those are all the places that that variant is found. Origen, okay, ancient church father, 3rd century guy, Origen, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, Book 6, Section 24, describes this reading as common but inaccurate. He says it's common but it's inaccurate. He doesn't like it. In the modern time frame, seemingly due to the fact that Gerasenes was reputed to be inaccurate, the majority of gospel manuscripts now seem to have been changed to have locality names other than Gerasenes. So what's going on here? This is a particular case where we have a church father saying this is a common reading at his time frame, Gerasenes. You look at the majority of manuscripts that we have now in the modern, though, and they don't have that reading. That reading is now a minority reading in the manuscript tradition that we have as a whole now. But at his time, he says that it was a common reading. It was not a minority reading according to him. It was a common one. So what does this mean? This means that that particular reading was deselected. Other readings were preferred over that one. And that I find extremely interesting. Other readings were preferred over this one. And Origen states as much in his commentary on it. He says that it's a common one, but it's not accurate, and therefore it shouldn't be perpetuated. And that seems to have exactly been what happened. He treats it preferentially, although it was common. Well, he preferentially selects against it, though it was common. And this is a pattern that later generations seem to emulate. They selected against that reading in favor of other readings. So there is historical evidence from the church fathers, from the early Christians who are writing about these things, who knew of multiple variants, that would list the multiple variants and go through and select variants from those based on their preferences, whatever those preferences happen to be. Sometimes it was just personal preference. Sometimes, a lot of times with Origen, it had to do with the geographical precedence. He wanted the New Testament to have words in it that matched the modern words that he was used to, that he knew of, and those kinds of things. So he wanted the ancient map basically to match the modern map. That was his basis of preference for a lot of these kinds of things, especially when it came to locality names and that sort of thing. But you do have early church fathers, and not just Origen. You have actually quite a few church fathers talking about variants that were common at one time that are not common anymore. And they actively give reasons for one against the other. They treat them preferentially. All right, so what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that the majority text statistical model has been broken and utterly destroyed many times over. In particular, it has been broken by countermodels that account for varying probabilities of reproduction, cessation, and preferential treatment. Further, all of these countermodels have been corroborated by actual historical evidence. Their germane historical evidence includes proportions of extant manuscripts that originate in different centuries, records of areas that ceased to produce Greek manuscripts based on language transition or conquest by a competing religion, and patristic references to readings that were once considered common that have now become uncommon. That is, there are a bunch of models that are out there that are contrary to the majority text model, and there's historical evidence for believing that those counter models would be accurate over the majority text model. And because there's so many ways that the majority text can be broken by varying this thing or by varying this thing over here, and because there's so much history that would support that those kinds of changes happened, it's actually very unlikely that the majority text actually wound up being the most correct version. It's very unlikely. There's so many ways to break the majority text. There's so many ways for it to be wrong, and so much history corroborating that the chances that the majority text wound up being the most accurate text is pretty much non-existent. Which is why most textual scholars today go with the earliest and best manuscripts rather than with the majority of manuscripts. The closer you are, generationally, the more likely you are to have good manuscripts. And also, if you're careful about the manuscripts that you look at, you actually examine them and see what kind of care and attention went into them, and you find the manuscripts that were done with the greatest care and the greatest concern for accuracy, those are the ones that are most likely to get you back to the original readings, rather than simply defaulting to the majority text, which may or may not be right. In fact, there's a lot of historical reasons to believe that it's wrong. So, yes, the majority text model that is out there is popular with some people, like Brother Truelove from Christ Reformed Church, but it doesn't really take into account history very well. It doesn't take into account counter models very well. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it just isn't sufficient to its task. Brother Truelove was so adamant in his video, and you can go back and watch it on his channel, Backwaters of Reformedom, his majority text statistical model is basically what his video is called. And he is so adamant that the only way to break it is with this official recension of the New Testament text, that the church hierarchy came in and said, okay, we're going to make an official version and everyone has to use this from now on. He says that's the only way to break it. No, there's lots of different ways to break it, and most of them have nothing to do with an official recension. The fact of the matter is that most texts tend to standardize themselves in history, regardless of whether or not there's an official recension. And that happened with the New Testament just as it happened with pretty much every other ancient document. What do I mean? What I mean is that when there are multiple versions of a text, it is almost inevitable that one of those versions is going to become more popular than the other ones just because of distribution, various things that happen in history, so on and so forth. One version becomes the most popular just because of more or less historical accidents that will happen along the way. And because there's so many ways to be wrong versus ways to be right, the chances are that the version that becomes the most popular, that becomes standardized in that sense, is going to be wrong. And I've talked about this in other videos as well. The New Testament text did become standardized by general production. They started producing things according to what had become popular before, and it just kind of perpetuated itself. But like I said, there's so many ways to be wrong that, and compared to the few number of ways, or the way to be right, that you're more likely to wind up with the standardized system being wrong than the standardized system being right. It's just the way it works. Not just with the biblical manuscripts, but with every manuscript, because ultimately all manuscripts are hand copies done by fallible people. And this comes to another issue that is really big for Brother Truelove. He always talks about presuppositions. What are your presuppositions going into things? And one of the most basic presuppositions that we're given in the Bible is that mankind is fallible and that we need to take steps against that fallibility. When we have something that has to come down to us through the hand of men, we should be suspicious. We should not trust the majority of men. We should not trust men, by and large, to get things right. Are we capable of getting things right from time to time? Yeah. That doesn't mean that we do, though. And this is where lots of people make certain assumptions about preservation that Scripture itself never promises. And Brother Truelove, for example, like a lot of people who are Reformed and have this particular opinion, they go to some of the great confessions of faith that talk about the preservation of Scripture. And they kind of ignore the historical context to a great extent that says, okay, the text has come down through history, great, but one of the things that those things never could mean in the original context, those confessions never could mean in the original context, is that the majority is right in history. That just isn't going to be a valid conclusion to make. It's just not there. And remember, these confessions come out of early Protestantism. Early Protestantism came out of Catholicism. Catholicism already had their official version of the text, the Latin Vulgate, and that was what the majority of people were using, and the Protestants were very sure that it was wrong. They didn't trust the majority then. Why should we start trusting the majority now? But because of how the confessions word some of their phrasing, there's people who get distracted by that and don't really think in very consistent terms historically. And frankly, even some of the framers of the confessions, in my opinion, didn't really think historically, and certainly not completely biblically when it came to some of this stuff. Because even in the Bible, you have, during the reign of King Josiah, you have the book of the law being lost in the temple of all places, but it was lost. It was unknown to people, and it was found in King Josiah's time. I should rephrase that. It was found in King Josiah's time, implying that before that it had been lost. Okay. The idea that God preserves his word in every generation in preponderance is not something that you can defend with the Bible, because the Bible gives the evidence that it can be lost to the majority in history. That's what Josiah's reign and the finding of the book of the law is very much about, is that it takes people who are dedicated to the truth to go out and seek it and apply it to it. And that's what Protestantism, new textual criticism, has been about. Christians seeking to know what was originally given and searching it out in detail. And then, of course, just being honest with the history and honest with the data, and being serious about the fact that mankind is fallible. That's a fundamental teaching of the Bible, is that not only is mankind fallible, but mankind is actually sinful, and that's what leads to his fallibility in a great many respects. Okay, there's only one who is ultimately infallible, and that is God, and then the word which originally came from God must necessarily then also be infallible. It's a resultant doctrine, it's not a primary one. People forget that as well. But I'm kind of getting off into sidetracks here, but presuppositions do matter. Do you presume that mankind is fallible, and therefore you shouldn't trust what has predominantly come down through the hands of men, even men who profess to be Christians, although a great many of them in more recent times have been Eastern Orthodox that have hand-transcribed Greek manuscripts? Do you, by and large, trust men, or are you, by and large, suspicious of men? Is really what it comes down to a great extent. And then there's also that whole question of providence. Would God allow his reformers, people who started going back to the truth, to have a bad copy of the text? Well, frankly, the Protestant Reformation didn't begin with Luther to a great extent. Luther certainly got the ball rolling as far as it becoming popular, but there were people who were protesting Roman Catholicism way before that with the Latin Vulgate. It's not an issue of the textual basis in and of itself as it is simply the truth itself. And the textual basis helps us get there. But frankly, even a really bad translation will still have enough truth in it to decry a lot of very bad things. Even say the Jehovah's Witnesses translation, the New World Translation, I think the new version of it that they put out is called like the Sword or something like that. But even their translation, as awful as it is when it comes to say the deity of Christ, it's not completely obliterated just because of the multiplicality of the biblical text. It's hard to get rid of every single reference to Jesus' deity. You can't do it. It's just, you can't have that kind of truly wholesale revision and still get away with calling it the Bible when everything is said and done. And so even in bad translations, you're still going to find enough truth to form the basis of reformation that would be necessary. However, just because a text is sufficient doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most accurate. And that's where these kinds of questions come in. Are we interested in what is most accurate? Or are we interested in perpetuating what was sufficient to get us out of Rome? That's really what it comes down to in a lot of ways. Are we interested in truly addressing that history and actually trying to get back to what was original, or are we interested in essentially going back to what got us out of Rome? That's it, as far as I'm concerned. That really is what is at the heart of the issue here. What do people want? Do people want what was original, and are they willing to do all the historical work necessary for that? Or do they want more or less an easy answer that touts our ancestors in the faith as, having everything essentially right? Because frankly, I don't believe our ancestors in the faith had everything essentially right. I believe that there's a lot of wisdom that they had. Okay, lots of good and definitely came of it. But they're not the standard. The standard is what was originally given back in the 1st century, not what the reformers came up with in the 16th century or 17th century, depending on which set of reformers you're talking about. Anyways, I've gone on enough. You got my points. The majority text model can be broken without an official recension. Texts tend to standardize through history anyways. It's not a matter of there ever being an official recension in most cases, except for like the Quran, where you have Caliph Uthman going and making an official recension. But most texts will standardize in history anyways, regardless of a recension. And a lot of it has to do with just the simple fact that there's lots of ways to be wrong, only one, or up to isomorphism, very few ways of being right. And so whatever text gets standardized, it's usually going to be the wrong one. It's just simple history. It's simple probability. And if you account for variability in your model, which the majority text model that is espoused by most majority text advocates does not account for, then you'll see that there are some significant problems with trusting the majority text. Anyways, I've rattled on for a good long time. Thank you very much for listening. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, May you come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.